She knocked on the wrong door in the castle, and the Duke opened it, and her fate was sealed. A simple servant girl, with nothing but a bundle of linens in her arms, suddenly stands face to face with the most powerful man in the realm. His eyes linger too long, his voice too kind, and in that instant, whispers begin to stir in every shadowed corridor. But behind the velvet curtains and candlelight, danger coils. A jealous rival plots her ruin. A stolen necklace, a trap in the night one's step, and her honor, her very life, could be destroyed. And yet, what if the Duke's heart dares to defy the chains of class and tradition? What if a knock on the wrong door was never a mistake at all, but destiny? Will love strong enough to shatter centuries of pride survive the lies and betrayals waiting in the dark? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Dawn broke over the village of Wexfordshire, painting the thatched roofs in soft golden light. In her mother's modest cottage, Margaret Holly smoothed her plain wool dress with trembling hands. Today marked her first day of service at Wexford Castle, and her heart fluttered like a caged bird beneath her carefully pressed collar. "Remember to mind your manners, dear heart," her mother said, helping Margaret gather the freshly pressed linens into a neat bundle. The fabric smelled of lavender and sunshine from drying in yesterday's breeze. "Keep your eyes lowered and your voice gentle." Margaret nodded, though her throat felt too tight for words. The weight of responsibility pressed upon her shoulders as surely as the bundle in her arms. Their family needed the wages she would earn at the castle, especially with winter approaching. The morning air nipped at her cheeks as she made her way through the awakening village. The baker's ovens already perfumed the air with the scent of fresh bread, and the cobbler's apprentice swept the street before his master's shop. Margaret's worn shoes clicked against the cobblestones as she approached the imposing castle gates. Her steps slowed as she gazed upward at the magnificent structure. Wexford Castle rose before her like something from a fairy tale, its gray stone towers reaching toward the heavens. Gargoyles peered down from their perches, their weathered faces watching as she presented her papers to the guards. Inside the castle walls, Margaret's wonder only grew. Tapestries adorned the walls, their colors still rich despite their age. Crystal chandeliers caught the morning light, sending rainbow sparkles dancing across the polished floors. The grandeur made her feel smaller than ever, like a sparrow that had wandered into a peacock's palace. The housekeeper had instructed her to deliver the linens to the east wing, but after several turns through the maze-like corridors, Margaret realized with growing dismay that she had lost her way. Each hallway looked identical to the last, with their rows of portraits and gleaming suits of armor standing sentinel. Gathering her courage, she approached a heavy oak door that she believed might lead to the linen chamber. Her knock sounded, timid even to her own ears, barely more than a whisper against the thick wood. The door swung open, and Margaret's heart nearly stopped. Instead of a fellow servant, she found herself face to face with His Grace, the Duke of Wexford himself. Alistair Blackwood stood tall and commanding in his morning coat, his dark hair falling in perfect waves above eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. I beg your pardon, Your Grace," Margaret stammered, dropping into a clumsy curtsy that nearly sent her bundle tumbling. "I was seeking the linen chamber. I'm new to service here, and I'm afraid I've lost my way." A smile touched the Duke's lips, warming his features. "An honest admission," he said, his voice rich and cultured, a rare quality in these halls. Margaret felt heat flood her cheeks under his steady gaze. Those eyes, they held such kindness, such intelligence. It unsettled her more than any stern look could have done. "The linen chamber lies 2 corridors hence, on your left," he informed her, his tone gentler than she would have expected from one of his station. "Shall I have someone show you the way?" "No," Margaret said quickly, then flushed deeper at her own boldness. "That is, no thank you, Your Grace. I've troubled you enough already." His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, and something in his expression made her heart skip a beat. "No trouble at all, Miss Halley, Your Grace, Margaret Halley." She clutched her bundle tighter, as though it might shield her from the strange flutter in her chest. "Miss Halley," he repeated softly, as though testing the sound of her name. Margaret bobbed another curtsy and hurried away, her footsteps echoing in the corridor. She didn't slow until she reached the servants' hall, her cheeks still burning from the encounter. "I must never cross paths with the Duke again," she whispered to herself, pressing her cool hands to her warm face. But even as she spoke the words, she knew she would not soon forget those kind eyes or the way he had smiled at her honest confusion. The servants' hall hummed with the clatter of wooden spoons and murmured conversations as Margaret found an empty spot at the long oak table. Her feet ached from hours of learning the castle's winding passages, and she longed to enjoy her bowl of vegetable soup in peaceful silence. "That's the one," a plump maid whispered 2 seats away, not quite soft enough. "Walk straight into His Grace's private chamber, bold as brass." Margaret's cheeks burned as she stirred her soup, pretending not to hear. The morning's mishap had clearly become the talk of the servants' quarters. "I heard he smiled at her," another maid added, her voice tinged with disapproval. "Imagine that, a duke smiling at a common housemaid." "Hush now," an older maid scolded, though her eyes sparkled with interest. "Though 'tis true, His Grace has been known to notice a pretty face." Before Margaret could sink further into her embarrassment, Mrs. Winters, the senior housekeeper, appeared behind her chair. The stern woman's shadow fell across Margaret's bowl. Like a storm cloud, "A word, if you please, Miss Halley." Margaret followed Mrs. Winters to a quiet corner of the hall, her soup forgotten. The housekeeper's face was lined with concern beneath her starched cap. "You would do well to keep your head down, girl," Mrs. Winters said in low, urgent tones. "Being noticed in this house, especially by His Grace, is no blessing. The walls have eyes, and tongues wag freely. A servant girl who draws attention rarely finds peace." "It was an honest mistake, Mrs. Winters," Margaret protested softly. "I had no intention." "Intentions matter little in great houses," the housekeeper cut in. "Remember your place, and pray you fade from memory quickly." The warning weighed heavy on Margaret's mind as she went about her evening duties. As darkness fell, she carried an armload of split logs toward the council chamber, where a late meeting was to be held. Approaching the heavy door, Margaret heard voices from within. She paused, not wishing to interrupt. "The Duke must be convinced," came the chamberlain's sharp tone. "The Austrian heiress brings a dowry that would save Wexford twice over. His Grace's romantic notions cannot be allowed to interfere." "He remains resistant," replied a voice Margaret recognized as belonging to Mr. Peters, the head steward. "Claims you would rather sell land than marry without affection. Foolishness. The estate needs more than just coin, it needs the political connection. The marriage contracts must be signed by Michaelmas, willing or not." Margaret's heart clenched at their cold calculations. She thought of the Duke's kind eyes that morning, how gentle his manner had been with a lost servant girl. Now these men plotted to trap him in a loveless marriage, caring nothing for his happiness. "His Grace will learn to be practical," the chamberlain continued. "After all, what duke has ever married for love?" Unable to bear more, Margaret crept away, leaving the firewood in a neat stack by the door. The castle's stone walls seemed to close in around her as she climbed the narrow servants' staircase to her attic chamber. Lying on her thin straw mattress, Margaret stared at the shadowed ceiling. From somewhere below, the faint strains of the court musicians drifted up, practicing perhaps for the grand balls where the Duke would soon dance with his foreign bride. She thought again of his smile, so warm and unguarded in that brief morning encounter. What a cruel fate, to be denied even the hope of choosing one's own heart's path. The music played on as Margaret turned her face to the wall, trying not to Think of the sadness that might dim those kind eyes once the marriage contracts were sealed. The morning bells of Wexfordshire Church rang clear and sweet across the misty grounds, calling the faithful to prime service. Margaret hurried along. With the other servants, her woolen shawl pulled tight against the dawn chill. Inside the church, she found her place on the worn wooden bench at the back, where servants traditionally sat apart from the gentry. The familiar words of Scripture brought her comfort, though her mind kept returning to yesterday's events. As the vicar's voice echoed through the stone chapel, Margaret noticed the Duke seated in the family pew near the altar. Even from this distance, his noble bearing set him apart. After the final hymn faded away, Margaret followed the stream of servants filing out of the church. Before she could return to her morning duties, Mr. Blackwood, the butler, appeared at her elbow. "Miss Halley," he said, his expression unreadable. "Come with me, if you please." Heart fluttering, Margaret followed him through the servants' entrance and up the narrow back stairs. The morning sun streamed through high windows, catching dust motes in its golden beams. In his office, Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat. "There has been a change in your duties, Miss Halley. His Grace has requested you be reassigned to his private household." Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. "I don't understand, sir. I've only just begun my work with the linens." "You will assist with His Grace's clothing and correspondence," Mr. Blackwood continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Report to Mrs. Wilson immediately for your new duties." As Margaret hurried down the corridor, she heard the whispers begin. "There she goes, the one who knocked on the wrong door." Her fate was sealed that very moment. Mrs. Wilson, the Duke's housekeeper, proved to be a stern but fair-minded woman who quickly set Margaret to work. "His Grace's riding gloves need mending," she said, handing Margaret a pair of fine leather gloves. "Mind your stitches are small and even." Margaret worked with care, her mother's lessons guiding her fingers as she repaired the soft leather. When she finished, Mrs. Wilson inspected her work with a critical eye before nodding in approval. "Now take these letters to His Grace's study," she instructed, passing Margaret a small stack of sealed correspondence. "He's expecting them." Margaret's knees felt weak as she approached the familiar oak door, but she forced herself to knock firmly. "Enter," called the Duke's deep voice. The study was warm and bright, with morning sunlight pouring through tall windows. Books lined the walls, their leather bindings gleaming. The Duke sat at a massive desk, but rose when Margaret entered. "Ah, Miss Halley," he said, smiling. "The letters, if you please." As Margaret handed him the correspondence, he noticed her careful movements. "I see you're becoming familiar with the duties of my household." "Yes, Your Grace," she replied softly. He selected one letter, breaking the seal. "Would you be so kind as to read this aloud?" "My eyes are weary from too much writing this morning." Margaret hesitated. I can read, Your Grace. My mother taught me, so I might study Scripture." His eyebrows rose with interest. "Indeed? That's quite uncommon among—" He paused, then asked more gently, "Your mother is the village seamstress, is she not?" "Yes, Your Grace. She believed reading God's Word would keep me on a righteous path. A wise woman, your mother." His voice held genuine respect. After Margaret finished her tasks and quietly left the study, the Duke remained at his desk, holding the newly mended riding gloves. His fingers traced the neat, even stitches as he contemplated the young woman who had just departed, a seamstress's daughter who carried herself with such quiet dignity, whose education and manner hinted at depths he had not expected to find among the serving class. Dark clouds gathered over Wexford Castle as Margaret hurried through the gardens, clutching a sealed message for the groundskeeper. The first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the newly bloomed spring flowers. With no time to return to the castle proper, she ducked beneath a stone archway thick with climbing roses. The sudden shower turned heavy, drumming against the gravel paths and creating curtains of water. Margaret pressed herself against the cool stone, watching the rain transform the carefully tended garden into a misty wonderland. The scent of wet earth and roses filled the air. "Miss Halley?" The Duke's voice startled her. He stood at the other end of the archway, his own clothes slightly damp from the rain. "Your Grace." Margaret curtsied quickly, conscious of her improper solitude with him. "I was delivering a message when the rain. No need for explanations," he said kindly, noting her discomfort. He unfastened his heavy cloak. "You're shivering." "Oh no, Your Grace, I couldn't possibly." But he was already draping the warm wool around her shoulders. "Nonsense. We can't have you catching a chill." His fingers brushed her shoulder, and though the touch was brief, it sent warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you," she murmured, drawing the cloak closer. It carried his scent leather, and SANDLWOOD. They stood in companionable silence, watching the rain. Finally the Duke spoke. "I've been meaning to thank you for your assistance these past evenings. Your reading voice brings new life to old verses." Margaret's cheeks warmed at the memory of those quiet hours in his study, reading from his collection of poetry and scripture while he worked at his desk. "I enjoy the readings, Your Grace, though," she hesitated, then continued softly, "I sometimes wonder if it's proper." "Proper?" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Is it improper to share the beauty of words? To find comfort in verses that speak to the soul?" "No, but," Margaret struggled to express her concerns. "My position. The other servants already whisper." "Let them whisper," he said, though his voice held a note of resignation. "In these moments, we are simply two people sharing the pleasure of literature." But they weren't simply two people. Margaret knew. He was a duke, and she was a servant, and the growing warmth in her heart whenever he was near was dangerous indeed. The rain began to ease, sunlight breaking through the clouds. Margaret moved to remove his cloak, but he raised a hand. "Keep it for now. Return it to my study this evening. Perhaps we could read from the Book of Psalms?" "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, unable to refuse despite her misgivings. That evening, as she read the ancient words of praise and supplication, Margaret was acutely aware of his presence. He sat closer than usual, ostensibly to better hear her voice over the crackling fire. When their eyes met over certain verses speaking of love and devotion, her voice would tremble slightly. Later, in her small attic room, Margaret knelt beside her narrow bed. The single candle cast dancing shadows on the sloped ceiling as she clasped her hands in prayer. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "grant me strength against these feelings that grow stronger each day. Help me remember my place, my duty. Protect my heart from impossible dreams." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Guide me away from these dangerous affections that can lead only to heartbreak." The candle flickered, and in its dim light, she could still smell the faint trace of sandalwood on her skin where his cloak had touched her. Margaret bowed her head lower, her prayers becoming more urgent as she sought divine intervention against the yearnings of her heart. The midsummer feast transformed Wexford Castle into a glittering spectacle. Torches blazed in iron brackets along the stone walls, their light catching on jewels and gilt trim as nobles swept through the great hall in a parade of wealth and status. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway as footmen carried enormous silver platters laden with roasted peacock, glazed fruits, and delicate pastries. "Stop gawking and keep moving." Mrs. Thimbleton, the cook, swatted at Margaret with a dish. "Towel, those pewter plates won't polish themselves." Margaret returned to her work, but couldn't help stealing glances at the arriving guests. Ladies in silk gowns rustled past, their hair piled high and adorned with feathers and pearls. Distinguished gentlemen in embroidered waistcoats bowed and exchanged pleasantries, their voices carrying through the corridors. Among the guests, Lady Katerina commanded attention. The foreign heiress wore a gown of deep crimson silk, her dark hair elegantly arranged with diamond pins that sparkled like stars. She moved with the confidence of one who knew her own worth and the power of her dowry. The Duke stood at the head of the great table, resplendent in midnight blue velvet, Margaret's heart quickened at the sight of him, though she tried to focus on her tasks. The feast began with a flourish of silver trumpets, and servants moved in practiced formations to serve the courses. As the second course was being cleared, the Duke's voice rose above the general murmur of conversation. "My lords and ladies, pray attend." He lifted his crystal goblet, and all eyes turned to him. "I would draw your attention to these fine table linens, particularly the exquisite embroidery work." Margaret froze in place, a stack of used plates in her hands. "This artistry," the Duke continued, "was created by one of our own household, Miss Margaret Halley. Her needle skills rival those of any royal seamstress." A ripple of polite appreciation moved through the assembly. Margaret felt her cheeks burn. As several nobles examined the intricate floral patterns she had stitched into the crisp white linen. For one shining moment, she stood transported, not a servant girl with calloused hands, but an artist whose work had earned the praise of nobility. Her joy was short-lived. From her place near the Duke's right hand, Lady Katerina's dark eyes fixed upon Margaret with calculating intensity. The heiress leaned closer to the Duke, placing her hand possessively near his on the table. "How unusual," she remarked, her accent making the words sharp as icicles, "to single out a servant for such notice." The Duke either missed or chose to ignore the edge in Lady Katerina's voice. "Talent deserves recognition, regardless of its source," he replied mildly, but his eyes sought Margaret's across the crowded hall. Lady Katerina did not miss that glance. Her fingers tightened around her goblet until her knuckles showed white. The feast continued late into the night. Margaret's arms ached from carrying heavy platters and clearing countless dishes. Most guests had retired to their chambers, leaving only servants to restore order to the great hall. As she gathered the last of the silver, Margaret heard voices from the adjacent chamber. She recognized Lady Katerina's distinctive accent, speaking in low, intense tones to the chamberlain. "This situation is untenable," the lady declared. "I have observed how His Grace looks at that maid. It is unseemly." "My lady, I assure you," the chamberlain began, but Lady Katerina cut him off. "No assurances. I am direct in this, that maid must be removed, or I shall not proceed with the marriage." The threat hung in the air like frost. "My dowry comes with conditions. See that it is done." Margaret's hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the silver she carried. She forced herself to move silently away from the chamber door, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had heard. The morning sun had barely touched the castle towers when shouts of alarm echoed through the stone corridors. Lady Katerina's precious diamond and pearl necklace, a family heirloom, worth more than a servant's lifetime of wages, had vanished from her chambers. The castle erupted into chaos as guards stormed through the servant quarters, turning over mattresses and rifling through personal belongings. Margaret sat at her small workstation in the servants' hall, her fingers trembling as she attempted to focus on mending one of the Duke's riding shirts. Around her, other maids whispered and cast nervous glances as boots thundered past the doorway. The head guard, a stern-faced man with graying temples, burst into the room with two others close. "Behind! Everyone will remain where they are," he announced, his voice sharp with authority. "Lady Katerina's necklace has gone missing, and we have reason to believe it was taken by someone in service." Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs as the guards methodically searched each corner of the hall. When they reached her workstation, time seemed to slow to an agonizing crawl. The head guard lifted her workbasket, and Margaret's blood turned to ice as his expression changed. "What's this, then?" He reached in and withdrew Lady Katerina's necklace, the pearls gleaming innocently in the morning light. Margaret stared in horror at the jewels dangling from his fingertips. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. No, I would never. Silence. The guard's command echoed off the stone walls. Fetch the chamberlain at once. Servants gathered in doorways, their faces a mixture of shock and pity as Margaret was roughly escorted to the great hall. The chamberlain arrived moments later, his usual composure cracked by a satisfied smirk that made Margaret's stomach turn. Behind him came Lady Katerina, her face a mask of outrage, though her eyes glittered with something that looked disturbingly like triumph. Your Grace, the chamberlain called out, and Margaret's heart clenched as Duke Alistair entered the hall, his expression carefully neutral. We have found the thief. The Duke's eyes met Margaret's for the briefest moment before sliding away. She saw the muscle in his jaw tighten, but he remained silent as the chamberlain presented the evidence. Found in her own workbasket, Your Grace, the chamberlain declared. This serving girl has betrayed your trust and hospitality. Such a crime cannot go unpunished. Lady Katerina stepped forward, her silk skirts rustling. To think I allowed her near my precious belongings. She must have been planning this theft all along. I didn't take it, Margaret protested, her voice breaking. Someone must have placed it there. Please, Your Grace. The Duke's hands clenched at his sides, but still he said nothing. Margaret could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he struggled between his position and what she hoped he knew in his heart to be true. But with Lady Katerina and her dowry at stake, with all eyes in the hall watching his every move, he remained frozen in place. The chamberlain seized control of the silence. Remove her from the premises immediately. Such a thief cannot be trusted under this roof for another moment. Rough hands gripped Margaret's arms as she was marched through the castle halls. Tears streamed down her face as she passed the study, where she had read poetry to the Duke, the garden archway where they had sheltered from the rain together. A small bundle of her belongings was thrust into her arms, her spare dress, her prayer book, her mother's shawl. The iron gates of Wexford Castle creaked open, and Margaret was pushed through them just as the sun began to set. She stumbled on the rough road, clutching her meager bundle to her chest as sobs racked her body. With nowhere else to turn, she began the long walk to her mother's cottage, leaving behind both her position and her heart within those castle walls. The night had grown cold and dark by the time Margaret finally stumbled up the narrow path to her mother's cottage. Her feet ached from the long walk, and her thin shawl offered little protection against the autumn chill. The small lantern in her hand cast dancing shadows on the muddy road as she approached the familiar thatched roof of her childhood home. Before she could knock, the wooden door flew open. Her mother, Sarah Halley, stood in the doorway with worry etched across her face. One look at Margaret's tear-stained cheeks told her everything she needed to know. "Oh, my sweet girl," Sarah whispered, pulling Margaret into her arms. The familiar scent of lavender and fresh bread enveloped her as she collapsed into her mother's embrace, letting out the sobs she had held back during her long walk home. "Come inside, love. You're chilled to the bone." Sarah guided her daughter to the hearth where a pot of broth simmered over the fire. The cottage was exactly as Margaret remembered, small but tidy, with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and a well-worn Bible on the table. Sarah ladled the warm broth into a wooden bowl and pressed it into Margaret's trembling hands. "Drink this, then tell me everything." As the warmth of the broth spread through her body, Margaret recounted the terrible events at the castle. Her mother listened without interruption, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The truth will come to light," Sarah said firmly when Margaret finished her tale. "The Lord sees all, my dear. We must trust in His timing." The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Margaret took up her needle once more, returning to the trade her mother had taught her since childhood. Word spread through the village that the Halley women were accepting mending work, and soon local farmers' wives and merchants began bringing their torn garments to the cottage. Margaret's fingers moved skillfully over each tear and loose seam, but her heart remained heavy. Every stitch reminded her of the fine clothes she had tended at the castle, of the quiet evenings reading to the Duke in his study. During the day, she focused on her work, grateful that at least she could help put bread on their table. But at night, alone in her small bed, tears would slip silently down her cheeks. Her mother never pressed her to speak of her grief, but offered comfort in other ways, a gentle touch on the shoulder, extra honey in her tea, or simply sitting together in companionable silence as they worked. They attended church faithfully, and Margaret found solace in the familiar prayers and hymns, clinging to her faith when all else seemed lost. Meanwhile, within the stone walls of Wexford Castle, Duke Alastair could find no peace. The sight of Margaret's devastated face as she was led away haunted his dreams. During the day, he watched Lady Katerina and the Chamberlain closely, noting their satisfied expressions and whispered conversations. His suspicions grew until he began making discreet inquiries among the servants. A young scullery maid finally came forward, trembling as she revealed what she had seen. The Chamberlain slipping into the servants' hall early that fateful morning, something glinting in his hands as he approached Margaret's workstation. Other witnesses emerged: a stable boy who had overheard Lady Katerina plotting with the Chamberlain, Alondras who had seen the Chamberlain carrying the necklace before it was reportedly stolen. The truth of their treachery became clear, and the Duke's heart grew heavy with the knowledge of his own failure to defend Margaret. One moonlit night, 2 weeks after Margaret's dismissal, the sound of hoofbeats broke the evening silence outside the Hawley cottage. Margaret looked up from her mending, startled by the unexpected noise. She rose slowly from her chair by the fire and moved to the door, her heart beating wildly in her chest. As she pulled open the heavy wooden door, her breath caught in her throat. There, dismounting from his horse in the pale moonlight, stood Duke Alastair himself. His traveling cloak was dusty from the road, his face weary but determined as he turned to face her. Margaret's mother quickly lit more candles as the Duke entered their humble cottage, his tall frame seeming to fill the small space. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls as Margaret stood frozen, her heart thundering in her chest. Her mother, sensing the gravity of the moment, quietly slipped into the back room, leaving them alone. "Your Grace," Margaret whispered, dropping into a curtsy. "I do not understand. Please," the Duke said, his voice thick with emotion. "Do not bow to me, not now." He removed his riding cloak, revealing his formal attire somewhat dampened by the evening mist. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled from the urgent ride. The fire crackled in the hearth as he stepped closer, his eyes filled with a torment that made Margaret's breath catch. "I have discovered the truth, Margaret. The Chamberlain conspired with Lady Katerina to plant that necklace among your belongings." Margaret's hand flew to her throat as tears sprang to her eyes. "Then, I didn't. I should have known from the start," he interrupted, his voice heavy with regret. "2 maids came forward yesterday. They witnessed the Chamberlain entering the servants' quarters with the necklace before it was discovered. I was a coward, Margaret. I let protocol and position silence me when I should have defended you." He crossed the small room in 2 strides, dropping to one knee before her. Margaret gasped, her heart seeming to stop as he took her work-roughened hands in his own. "I come to you now not as His Grace, the Duke of Wexford, but as Alastair, a man who has found himself utterly lost without you." His thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms. "These past days have been torture, knowing you were cast out unjustly, knowing you suffered while I remained silent." "My lord," Margaret breathed, trembling. "The scandal, your position. I care nothing for position." His voice was fierce yet tender. "I love you, Margaret Hawley. Your gentle spirit, your quiet strength, your pure heart, they have captured me completely. When you read to me in those evening hours, your voice brought poetry to life in ways I had never known. Your presence made my study warm for the first time in years." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she struggled to find words. "But surely you must see, a duke cannot marry a seamstress's daughter. The Tun would never accept it." "Let them whisper," he said firmly. "I would rather face their scorn with you by my side than spend a lifetime in hollow luxury without you." His blue eyes shone with sincerity in the firelight. "Tell me truly, Margaret, do you love me as I love you?" Margaret's heart felt as though it might burst. The truth she had pushed down for so long could no longer be contained. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "God help me, I do love you, with all my heart." The Duke Alistair raised her hands to his lips, pressing fervent kisses to her fingers. "Then nothing else matters. At dawn, I shall return to the castle and expose the Chamberlain's treachery before the entire household. I will clear your name and declare my intentions, whatever the consequences." "The scandal will be terrible," Margaret said softly, though she couldn't bring herself to pull her hands away. "Let it be." He rose, still holding her hands in his. "I vow to you, Margaret, I will set all to rights. Even if it means facing the Tun's disapproval, even if some turn their backs, I choose you, I choose love. Will you trust me to make this right?" Margaret looked up into his beloved face, seeing there all the strength and tenderness that had first captured her heart. Slowly she nodded, allowing hope to bloom in her chest. Like a flower reaching for the sun, the morning sun streamed through the towering windows of Wexford Castle's great hall, casting long shadows across the polished stone floor. Nobles in their finest silks and velvets stood shoulder to shoulder with servants in their simple linens. The air hummed with whispers and speculation about why they had all been summoned so urgently. Margaret stood beside Duke Alistair at the front of the hall, her hands clasped tightly to stop their trembling. Though she wore her best dress, freshly pressed by her mother the night before, she felt every eye upon her, questioning her presence beside their lord. Yet when she glanced up at the Duke, his unwavering gaze gave her strength. The Duke raised his hand, and silence fell across the hall. "My loyal subjects and honored guests," his voice rang clear and strong. "I have gathered you here to right a grave injustice and reveal a plot that has wounded this household's honor." At his signal, 2 guards brought forth the Chamberlain, who struggled against their grip. The man's face had gone pale as milk, his usual arrogance replaced by naked fear. "This man," the Duke continued, "whom I trusted with the keeping of this castle's affairs, has betrayed that trust most grievously." He gestured to an elderly maid who stepped forward, wringing her apron in nervous hands. "Speak what you witnessed." "Good woman," the Duke commanded gently. The maid's voice quavered, but grew stronger as she spoke. "I saw him, clear as day, sneaking into the servants' quarters that morning. He placed Lady Katarina's necklace in Miss Margaret's workbasket with his own hands. Your Grace." A gasp rippled through the assembled crowd. Lady Katarina, standing among the nobles, turned a shocking shade of red. 2 more witnesses came forward. A stable boy who had overheard the Chamberlain's plotting with Lady Katarina, and a scullery maid who had seen him receive a purse of gold for his treachery. The Chamberlain fell to his knees, babbling excuses, but the Duke's voice cut through, his pleas like a sword. "You are stripped of your office and titles. By nightfall, you will leave these lands, never to return." As the guards dragged the disgraced man away, the Duke turned to Margaret. His eyes softened as he took her hand. "Before you all, I declare Margaret Hawley innocent of all wrongdoing. Moreover, I proclaim her virtue and nobility of spirit to be worth more than any foreign dowry or political alliance." The king, who had watched the proceedings in thoughtful silence, stepped forward from his place of honor. His presence commanded immediate attention, and even the Duke bowed deeply. "We have witnessed today not only the triumph of truth over treachery," the king declared, his voice resonating through the hall, "but also the courage of a noble heart, regardless of birth." He turned to Margaret, who sank into a deep curtsy. "Rise, my child. Your grace in the face of injustice and your steadfast character have moved us deeply. By our royal favor, we grant you the title of Lady Margaret of Wexfordshire." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as the king's words washed over her. The title was small compared to the great nobles of the land, but it bridged the gulf between her common birth and the Duke's exalted station. The Duke's face shone with joy as he clasped Margaret's hand firmly in his own. "With your blessing, Your Majesty," he said, "I would make Lady Margaret my Duchess." Joining our hands and hearts before God and these witnesses, a murmur of approval swept through the great hall. Even the nobles who had once looked down their noses at the seamstress's daughter now nodded in acceptance. They had seen justice done and love triumph over artifice and greed. The morning sun seemed to shine brighter as it fell upon their joined hands, the Duke and his chosen bride standing proudly before their people, their love no longer hidden but proclaimed before the world. The castle chapel glowed with morning light streaming through ancient stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned patterns across the stone floors. Villagers in their Sunday best filled the wooden pews, while nobles in their finery occupied the front rows. The scent of fresh wildflowers and burning beeswax candles filled the air as the congregation waited with bated breath. Margaret stood in the chapel's antechamber, her fingers smoothing the skirts of her wedding gown, a masterpiece she had lovingly stitched over countless evenings. The ivory silk, a gift from Alistair, flowed like water beneath her careful embroidery of tiny roses and forget-me-nots. Her mother dabbed tears from her eyes as she adjusted Margaret's veil one final time. "My dearest girl," her mother whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Who could have known that morning I sent you to the castle would lead to this blessed day?" The chapel bells began their joyous peal, and Margaret took her first steps down the flower-strewn aisle. Gasps of admiration rippled through the gathering as she passed. Even the proudest noble ladies could not deny her radiance, not just from her gown or the pearls at her throat, but from the pure joy that illuminated her face. Duke Alistair waited at the altar, resplendent in his finest coat, his eyes never leaving Margaret as she approached. The love shining in his gaze made her feel like the only person in the world. When she reached his side, he took her trembling hands in his steady ones. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his voice echoing off the chapel's vaulted ceiling. "We are gathered here in the sight of God. The Duke's vows rang clear and true through the hushed chapel. "I, Alistair, take thee, Margaret, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Tears of joy spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she spoke her own vows, her voice steady despite her overwhelming emotions. The simple gold ring slipped onto her finger felt like a dream made real. After the priest pronounced them man and wife, the celebration spilled into the castle's great hall. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh breads, and sweet delicacies. Servants who had once been Margaret's fellow workers raised glasses in celebration, while village children danced to the merry tunes of fiddles and pipes. Even the most reserved nobles found themselves tapping their feet to the music. Old Thomas, the baker who had known Margaret since she was a child, led the villagers in traditional wedding songs. Their voices lifted to the rafters, singing of love that conquered all barriers. The Duchess of Marlborough, who had once looked down her nose at Margaret, now approached to offer genuine congratulations. Impressed by the grace with which the former seamstress's daughter carried herself, as evening descended, Margaret found herself wondering at the strange turns of fate. Just months ago, she had been a simple maid, lost in the castle's corridors, knocking on the wrong door. Now here she stood, a duchess, surrounded by the love and acceptance of two worlds that had once seemed forever separate. When the festivities began to quiet, Margaret and Alistair slipped away to the castle's western balcony. The summer night wrapped around them like silk as they gazed out over their lands. where pinpoints of light from village windows twinkled like earthbound stars. Alistair drew her close, his arms warm and secure around her waist. "You knocked upon the wrong door, Margaret," he whispered against her hair, "yet it opened to the right future." Margaret leaned back into his embrace, her heart so full it felt it might burst. Here, in the arms of the man she loved, watching over the land and people they would care for together, she knew that love truly had sealed her fate, not in servitude or scandal, but in joy everlasting. Thank you for watching. Stories like this remind us who we are. If something touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another story that just might stay with you.